The red dust never settled on Kepler 442b. Jake Morrison wiped his goggles clean for the third time that morning as he climbed down from the atmospheric processor. The massive machine hummed behind him, filtering the toxic air into something breathable for the workers below. Without these processors, every living thing on this mining world would die in minutes. Jake had been fixing these machines for 2 years now. 2 long years since the transport ship had dropped him off with nothing but his engineering tools and a work contract he couldn't break. The hegemony didn't believe in early releases. The mining colony stretched out before him like a metal wound in the planet's surface. Gray buildings squatted between the mining pits, connected by covered walkways that protected workers from the acid rain. Humans and Zephyrians moved through the complex like ants, carrying tools and materials from one site to another. Jake watched a group of Zephyrian workers loading ore carts near the main pit. Their blue-tinted skin gleamed with sweat, and the ceremonial scars on their arms marked them as members of different family groups. The Zephyrians were proud people even in chains. They carried themselves with dignity despite the slave collars around their necks. The humans looked different, beaten down. Most kept their eyes on the ground and spoke in whispers. Jake understood why. The hegemony had been harder on humanity during the conquest. They said humans were naturally rebellious and needed more control. Morrison, a harsh voice cut through the air. Jake turned to see Overseer Grix approaching, his 6 legs clicking against the metal walkway. The spider-like alien's compound eyes fixed on Jake with obvious irritation. Processor 7 is making noise again. Fix it. Jake nodded and gathered his tools. He had learned not to argue with the overseers. Arguments led to reduced food rations, and he was already thin enough. The walk to Processor 7 took him past the data processing center. Through the windows, he could see rows of workers hunched over computer terminals, their fingers flying across alien keyboards. Most were Zephyrians. The hegemony said they had steadier hands for detailed work. One worker looked up as he passed. Jake recognized her immediately, Lyra Veltar. She was younger than most Zephyrians in the colony, maybe 25 in human years. Her family scars were still fresh, marking her as recently arrived. Unlike the others, she sometimes smiled. Their eyes met through the glass. Lyra raised her hand in a small wave. Jake waved back, earning a suspicious look from the human worker beside him. "You shouldn't talk to them," the man muttered. His name was Pete, and he had been on Kepler 442b for 5 years. "Zephyrians don't trust humans. They think we're weak," Jake shrugged. "Maybe some are different." Pete shook his head. "None of them are different. They blame us for not fighting harder during the war. Like we had a choice against hegemony battlecruisers." Jake didn't answer. He had heard this conversation 100 times. Humans blamed Zephyrians for surrendering their worlds too quickly. Zephyrians blamed humans for not being strong enough to win. Meanwhile, the hegemony kept them both working in the mines. Processor 7 was louder than usual. Jake opened the maintenance panel and immediately saw the problem. A coolant line had cracked, causing the system to overheat. It was an easy fix, but he would need parts from the supply depot. The supply depot was run by a Zephyrian named Kale Veltar. Jake had dealt with him before. Kale was Lyra's older brother, built like a soldier with scars that spoke of battles fought and lost. He viewed humans with barely concealed contempt. "What do you need?" Kale asked without looking up from his inventory sheet. "Coolant line, size 7, for the atmospheric processor." Kale's eyes flickered with annoyance. "That's the 3rd one this month. Maybe humans should learn to maintain equipment properly." Jake felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice steady. "The equipment is old. Parts wear out." "Everything is old here," said another voice. Jake turned to see 2 more Zephyrians approaching, Dren and Voss Veltar, Kale's younger brothers. All 3 shared the same proud bearing and the same distrust of humans. Dren was thin and quick, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Voss was built like Kale but younger, with anger simmering just below the surface. Both had the kind of scars that came from fighting hegemony guards. "The human wants parts," Kale told his brothers. Again, Voss stepped closer to Jake. "Maybe the problem isn't the machines. Maybe it's the person fixing them." Jake met his gaze steadily. "I keep the processors running. Everyone breathes because of that work." "Everyone breathes because the hegemony allows it," Dren said quietly. "Don't pretend you're saving anyone." Before Jake could respond, the supply depot's door chimed. Lyra entered carrying a data pad and looking distracted. She glanced between her brothers and Jake, sensing the tension immediately. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. No problem, Cale said, grabbing a coolant line from the shelf. The human was just leaving. Jake took the part and nodded to Lyra. Thank you. As he turned to go, he heard Voss speaking to his sister in their own language. The words were harsh, clearly a warning. Lyra's response was softer but firm. Jake didn't understand the language, but he recognized the tone of an argument. Back at Processor 7, Jake installed the new coolant line and ran a diagnostic check. The machine's hum returned to normal, and the temperature readings dropped back into safe ranges. Another day, another small victory against this hostile world. That evening, Jake sat in the human quarters eating his ration pack. The food was tasteless but filling enough to keep him working. Around him, other humans talked quietly about quotas and work assignments. No one mentioned escape. No one mentioned resistance. Those conversations had ended years ago with public executions. Through his small window, Jake could see the Zephyrian quarters across the courtyard. Their building was identical to the human one, gray metal walls, small windows, and guard towers at each corner. But somehow the Zephyrians had managed to keep more of their culture alive. Sometimes he could hear them singing in the evenings, their voices carrying ancient melodies across the empty space between the buildings. Jake wondered what Lyra was doing now. Probably reading or talking with her brothers about the day's work. He had noticed that she always seemed to be thinking about something else, as if part of her mind was somewhere far from this place. Tomorrow would bring more broken machines and more repairs. More suspicious looks from Zephyrians who saw humans as failures. More resigned acceptance from humans who saw no point in hoping for better. But tonight, Jake allowed himself to remember Lyra's smile and the small wave she had given him. In a place designed to crush hope, sometimes the smallest kindnesses felt like miracles. The red dust continued to swirl outside his window, and the atmospheric processors hummed their mechanical lullabies. Another day on Kepler 4042b was ending, and another would begin soon enough. Jake closed his eyes and tried to dream of better worlds. The alarm started blaring at dawn. Jake woke to the harsh sound echoing through the human quarters, followed by the heavy footsteps of hegemony guards in the corridors outside. Emergency alarms meant trouble, and trouble usually meant someone would suffer for it. Jake dressed quickly and joined the stream of workers heading toward the central courtyard. Humans and Zephyrians gathered in separate groups as always. The guards formed a circle around them, their energy weapons gleaming in the red morning light. Commander Thex stood on the raised platform at the center of the courtyard. The hegemony officer was built like a walking tank, with gray armor covering most of his body. His forearms gestured dramatically as he spoke, and his voice carried easily across the silent crowd. Workers of Mining Station Epsilon 7, Thex announced, we have discovered a serious crime. Yesterday's mineral shipment is missing. 12 tons of processed platinum worth more than all of your miserable lives combined. Jake felt his stomach tighten. Missing shipments meant investigations. Investigations meant punishment. The hegemony didn't care about finding the real criminal. They just wanted someone to blame. Our security systems were compromised, Thex continued. The footage was corrupted, but we have other ways of finding the guilty party. The theft occurred during the night shift between midnight and 4 in the morning. Jake's eyes found Lyra in the crowd of Zephyrians. She was standing with her brothers, but something was wrong. Her face was pale, and she kept glancing toward the guards. Cale had his hand on her shoulder, a protective gesture that made Jake's worry deepen. We have identified the primary suspect, Thex said, his voice rising with obvious pleasure. Access logs show that Terminal 7 in the data processing center was used to alter shipping records. The last person to log into that terminal was Lyra Veltar. The crowd stirred uneasily. Jake watched as 4 guards moved toward the Zephyrian section. Lyra's brother stepped forward, but more guards appeared, energy weapons raised. There would be no heroic rescue, no dramatic last stand. Just another day of hegemony justice. Lyra was pulled from the crowd and dragged to the platform. She walked with dignity, her head held high despite the chains they put on her wrists. When she reached the center, Thex grabbed her chin and forced her to look at him. Do you confess to stealing hegemony property? He demanded. I did not steal anything, Lyra said clearly. Her voice carried across the silent courtyard, and Jake heard the truth in it. Thex backhanded her across the face. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, and Lyra staggered but did not fall. Lying will only make your punishment worse, he said. I worked late that night, Lyra continued, blood trickling from her split lip. I was updating inventory records. I did not steal anything. Jake remembered that night. He had been working on Processor 3, which gave him a clear view of the data processing center. He had seen Lyra through the windows, hunched over her terminal for hours. She had been doing exactly what she said, working late on routine tasks. But he had also seen something else. Around 2 in the morning, Lieutenant Vex had visited the data center. The hegemony officer had been there for nearly an hour, alone with the computers. Jake had thought it strange at the time but hadn't said anything. Questioning the actions of hegemony officers was a good way to end up dead. Now he wondered if Vex had been covering his tracks. Jake had heard rumors that some hegemony officers were selling resources on the black market. It would explain the missing shipments that had been plaguing the colony for months. The evidence is clear, Vex announced. Under hegemony law, the penalty for theft of resources is 20 lashes. The sentence will be carried out immediately. 20 lashes. Jake had seen hegemony punishments before. The energy whips didn't just cut skin. They burned through flesh and muscle. Few people survived 20 lashes, and those who did were never the same afterward. Lyra was small, even for a Zephyrian. 20 lashes would kill her. Jake looked at her brothers in the crowd. Kale's face was twisted with rage, but he remained still. All 3 brothers had been caught in previous resistance activities. Any attempt to interfere would result in their immediate execution. The punishment post was brought out, a metal frame with restraints for wrists and ankles. Guards began setting it up while others prepared the whips. Each whip was designed to deliver maximum pain, while keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. Jake watched Lyra's face as they explained what would happen to her. She showed no fear, only a quiet sadness. She was innocent, and she knew it. But innocence meant nothing to the hegemony. The other workers began to disperse. Some humans looked relieved that it wasn't one of them. Most Zephyrians watched with obvious anger, but made no move to intervene. Everyone knew that helping the condemned only meant joining them. Jake found himself remembering something his father had told him long ago, before the war, before the conquest. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that you'll suffer for it. But if you don't do the right thing when it matters, you stop being human. His father had died in the first wave of the invasion, fighting hegemony ships with weapons that might as well have been rocks. Jake had always wondered if his father's sacrifice had meant anything. Now, watching Lyra being dragged toward the punishment post, he began to understand. The hegemony maintained control through fear and division. They kept humans and Zephyrians suspicious of each other. They made sure that helping others was too dangerous to consider. They had built a system where good people watched bad things happen and did nothing. Jake thought about the access codes that had implicated Lyra. He knew she worked with inventory systems, but shipping records were handled by different terminals. Someone had planted evidence to frame her, and Jake was beginning to suspect who. He also remembered an obscure regulation he had read during his first week on the colony. All workers received orientation packets that included hundreds of pages of hegemony law. Most people ignored them, but Jake had been bored and desperate for anything to read. There was a provision that allowed one person to take another's punishment under certain circumstances. It was designed to let wealthy criminals buy their way out of trouble by having servants take their beatings. But the law was written broadly enough that it might apply here. Jake looked at Lyra one more time. She was being chained to the punishment post now, her back exposed to the whips. In a few minutes she would begin dying slowly and painfully for a crime she didn't commit. He thought about his father's words. He thought about 2 years of broken machines and small kindnesses. He thought about the smile Lyra had given him just yesterday, a moment of human connection in a place designed to destroy such things. Jake took a deep breath and made his choice. He stepped forward from the crowd, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Wait," he called out. "I invoke substitution rights under Hegemony Regulation 477. Every eye in the courtyard turned toward him. Commander Thex looked puzzled, then intrigued. Lyra stared at him in shock and growing horror as she realized what he was doing. Jake walked toward the platform, his heart pounding but his voice steady. He was about to discover if his father had been right about doing the right thing, and if the price of being human was worth paying. The courtyard fell completely silent. Jake's words hung in the air like smoke, and everyone stared at him as if he had lost his mind. Maybe he had, but he kept walking toward the platform where Commander Thex waited with obvious amusement. Regulation 477, Thex repeated, his voice carrying a hint of laughter. I haven't heard that one in years. Tell me, human, do you even know what you're asking for? Jake stopped at the base of the platform and looked up at the hegemony commander. I'm requesting the right to take her punishment in her place. Thex's forearms gestured dismissively. That regulation requires compelling justification. What possible reason could you have for such stupidity? Jake had thought about this during his walk across the courtyard. The law was designed for people with existing relationships, family members, business partners, or servants with formal contracts. But Jake needed to find a connection that Thex would accept. As maintenance supervisor for atmospheric processing, I oversee multiple workstations, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. Lyra Veltar works in data processing, which coordinates with my department for equipment tracking. Under colonial work protocols, this makes me her indirect supervisor. It was technically true, though barely. The work departments were loosely connected, and Jake had no real authority over data processing. But the hegemony loved bureaucracy, and their regulations were full of obscure connections between different job classifications. Thex studied him with obvious interest. Even if I accept this dubious chain of command, the regulation requires that you assume responsibility for her actions. Are you confessing to the theft? This was the dangerous part. If Jake claimed responsibility for the crime, he would face the full penalty. But if he maintained Lyra's innocence while taking her punishment, he might be able to expose the real criminal later. I'm not confessing to theft, Jake said carefully. I'm accepting supervisory responsibility for any security breach that occurred through my department's systems. Thex considered this for a long moment. Jake could see him weighing the entertainment value of watching a human suffer against the bureaucratic complications of the substitution request. Finally, the commander smiled. Very well, Thex announced. I find your justification compelling enough to be amusing. Under Regulation 477, you may take her place. However, the law also states that voluntary substitution reduces the sentence by half. Instead of 20 lashes, you will receive 10. Jake felt a mixture of relief and terror. 10 lashes might not kill him, but they would certainly leave permanent damage. He looked at Lyra, who was staring at him with an expression of pure shock. Her lips formed a single word, why? Behind her, Jake could see her 3 brothers in the crowd. Kale's face had gone completely blank. Dren looked confused, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't understand. Voss appeared angry, but Jake wasn't sure if the anger was directed at him or at the situation. The guards began unlocking Lyra's chains. She stood slowly, her legs shaking from the shock of reprieve. As they led her away from the punishment post, she tried to speak to Jake, but a guard pushed her back toward the crowd. Jake was brought forward and chained in her place. The metal restraints were still warm from Lyra's wrists. He faced outward toward the crowd so everyone could watch him suffer. It was part of the show, part of the system of fear that kept the colony running. Commander Thex stepped down from the platform to inspect the whips personally. Each one was about 3 feet long, crackling with energy that would burn through skin like acid. The punishment was designed to be educational as much as painful, a reminder to everyone watching about the price of defying hegemony authority. Any last words before we begin? Thex asked, his voice mockingly formal. Jake looked out at the crowd of humans and Zephyrians. Most wouldn't meet his eyes. They were already distancing themselves from what was about to happen, protecting their own sanity by pretending he deserved whatever came next. But some were still watching. Pete, the human worker who had warned him about trusting Zephyrians, was staring with obvious bewilderment. A few other humans looked confused or grudgingly respectful. Among the Zephyrians, reactions were more varied. Some appeared contemptuous. Why should they care if a human suffered? Others looked thoughtful, as if Jake's actions had challenged assumptions they had held for years. Lyra was standing with her brothers now, tears streaming down her face. She was trying to speak, but Kale held her back with gentle force. Jake could see him talking to her urgently, probably trying to explain why she couldn't interfere. I don't have anything to say, Jake told Thex. The commander shrugged and stepped back. He nodded to the guard holding the first whip. Begin, The first lash hit Jake between his shoulder blades like a bolt of lightning. The energy burned through his work shirt and into his flesh, leaving a line of charred skin and exposed muscle. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not just the physical agony, but the way the energy disrupted his nervous system, making his entire body convulse. Jake bit down on his tongue to keep from screaming. He tasted blood and focused on that sensation, using it to anchor himself against the overwhelming pain. He would not give Thex the satisfaction of hearing him break. The second lash crossed the first at an angle, creating an X-shaped burn across his back. Jake's knees buckled, but the chains held him upright. His vision blurred, and he could hear someone sobbing in the crowd. He hoped it wasn't Lyra. By the fourth lash, Jake's back was a mess of burned flesh and exposed bone. His work shirt hung in smoking tatters, and blood ran down his legs to pool on the platform. The smell of burned meat filled the air, making several spectators turn away in disgust. Jake's mind began to drift. The pain was so intense that his brain started shutting down non-essential functions. He found himself thinking about strange things. The color of Earth's sky, the taste of his mother's cooking, the sound of rain on a roof. Anything except the fire consuming his back. The seventh lash nearly knocked him unconscious. Jake's head snapped forward and he felt his consciousness slipping away. But then he heard something that brought him back. Lyra's voice calling his name in her own language. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the emotion behind them. Jake forced his head up and looked at the crowd. Lyra was fighting against her brother's restraint, trying to reach him. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes blazed with something Jake had never seen before, fury. Not at him, but at the system that had forced this choice upon them both. The 8th and 9th lashes came quickly, professionally delivered to maximize pain while keeping the victim conscious. Jake's world had shrunk to a single point of agony, but he held onto Lyra's voice like a lifeline. The 10th and final lash was the worst. Thex had taken the whip himself for this one, putting extra force behind it. The energy tore through muscle down to Jake's ribs, and this time he couldn't stop himself from screaming. Then it was over. Jake hung from the chains, his back destroyed and his consciousness fading. He could hear voices around him, some giving orders, others expressing shock or disgust. Someone was checking his pulse, probably to make sure he hadn't died and cheated the spectators of their show. Through the haze of pain, Jake saw Lyra break free from her brothers and run toward him. The guards tried to stop her, but Kale was suddenly there, along with Dren and Voss. The three brothers formed a protective circle around their sister as she knelt beside Jake. Jake tried to speak, but only blood came out. Lyra was touching his face gently, whispering words he couldn't understand, but her touch was cool and soft, a blessed relief from the fire in his back. The last thing Jake saw before darkness claimed him was Kale kneeling beside his sister. The proud Zephyrian warrior was staring at Jake with an expression of wonder, and something that might have been respect. Then Jake's world went black, and the pain finally stopped. Jake drifted in and out of consciousness for 3 days. When he was awake, the pain in his back made thinking impossible. When he slept, fever dreams mixed with memories until he couldn't tell what was real anymore. Sometimes he thought he was back on Earth, working in his father's garage. Sometimes he believed he was still chained to the punishment post, waiting for lashes that never came. Most often, he dreamed of cool hands touching his face and a gentle voice speaking words he almost understood. On the 4th day, Jake woke up properly for the first time. He was lying face down on a narrow bed in what looked like the colony's medical bay. The room was small and sterile, with white walls that hurt his eyes after so many days of darkness. "Don't try to move," a voice said softly. Jake turned his head carefully and saw Lyra sitting in a chair beside his bed. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and worry lines around her mouth. "How long?" Jake's voice came out as a croak. 4 days, Lyra replied. She reached for a cup of water on the bedside table and helped him drink. The water was cool and clean, better than anything Jake had tasted in months. "You shouldn't be here," Jake said when he could speak again. "The guards won't like it." Lyra's expression hardened. "My brother spoke to the guards. They understand now." Jake tried to push himself up on his elbows, but fire shot through his back and he collapsed with a gasp. Lyra placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, keeping him still. "The medical scanner says you'll heal," she said quietly. "But you'll have scars. Deep ones." Jake had expected as much. Energy whips didn't just cut. They burned tissue at the cellular level. The scars would be permanent reminders of this day for the rest of his life. "Why did you do it?" Lyra asked suddenly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but Jake heard years of confusion and wonder in those 4 words. Jake was quiet for a long moment, trying to find the right answer. The truth was complicated, a mixture of justice and impulse, of his father's words and his own stubborn refusal to watch an innocent person suffer. But maybe the simple truth was better. "Because you didn't deserve it," he said finally. "And someone had to care." Lyra's eyes filled with tears. She looked away, struggling with emotions that Jake couldn't begin to understand. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with feeling. "In my culture, what you did has a name. We call it Velthara, the bond of ultimate sacrifice. It means one person willingly takes another's pain to preserve their life or honor. It creates a debt that can never be repaid." Jake frowned. "I don't want payment. I just wanted you to live." "That's what makes it Velthara," Lyra explained. "If you had asked for something in return, it would just be a bargain. But you asked for nothing. You gave everything. That creates something sacred." The door to the medical bay opened and Jake tensed, expecting to see guards or overseers coming to drag him back to work. Instead, 3 familiar figures entered, Kale, Dren, and Voss Veltar. The brothers approached slowly, their expressions serious but not hostile. Jake had never seen them look at any human without at least some contempt. Now they watched him with something approaching reverence. Kale was the first to speak. "We need to talk," he said simply. Jake tried to sit up again, ignoring the pain in his back. This time Lyra helped him, propping pillows behind him so he could face her brothers properly. "We owe you an apology," Kale continued. "We judged all humans by the actions of a few. We believed you were weak because your people surrendered quickly during the conquest." "We did surrender quickly," Jake pointed out. Voss stepped forward, his young face serious. "So did we. The hegemony had weapons we couldn't fight, but we blamed you for not dying uselessly the way we did." Dren nodded agreement. "We lost 3 worlds before we realized that fighting their ships with swords was suicide. But we were angry, and anger needed a target. Humans were easier to blame than ourselves." Jake looked between the 3 brothers, seeing something he had never expected. Shame. These proud warriors, who carried their battle scars like badges of honor, were ashamed of their prejudice. "You don't need to apologize," Jake said. "We've all said things we shouldn't have." "Yes, we do," Kyle replied firmly. "What you did for our sister. We have never seen such honor from anyone, human or Zephyrian. You took her pain and asked for nothing. In our culture, that makes you family." Lyra spoke to her brothers in their own language, her voice urgent. They responded in kind, and Jake listened to the rapid exchange without understanding the words but recognizing the tone of an important discussion. Finally, Kale turned back to Jake. "My sister has told us what she believes about the theft. She thinks Lieutenant Vex has been stealing from the shipments for months." Jake felt his heart skip. He had suspected the same thing but hadn't dared voice it aloud. Accusing hegemony officers was a death sentence. "I saw him in the data center that night," Jake said quietly, around 2 a.m. "He was there for almost an hour." Dren's eyes sharpened. "Doing what?" "I don't know. But he was alone with the computers. And he looked nervous." The brothers exchanged glances. Voss spoke first. "We've been tracking supply irregularities for months. Small amounts, but consistent. Someone with access to shipping records and transport schedules." "We thought it was one of the human workers," Dren admitted. "We didn't consider that a hegemony officer might be involved." Kale leaned closer to Jake's bed. "If we can prove Vex is stealing, it might save others from being framed. But we'll need evidence." Jake thought about this carefully. Lieutenant Vex was smart and careful. He wouldn't leave obvious traces of his activities. But every thief made mistakes eventually, and Jake had noticed things during his 2 years of maintenance work. "The atmospheric processors log all power usage," Jake said slowly. "If someone was using extra computer time to alter records, it would show up in the power consumption data." Lyra's face lit up with understanding. "The data processing center showed anomalous power usage 3 times last month. I wrote reports about it, but no one investigated. Because the person receiving those reports was probably covering for the thief," Dren realized. Voss clenched his fists. "So our sister nearly died to protect a corrupt hegemony officer." Jake saw the anger building in the young Zephyrian's eyes and recognized it as dangerous. "Getting angry won't help," he said quietly. If we want to stop this, we need to be smart about it. Kyle nodded slowly. The human is right. Rushing into action will only get us killed, but we can't let this continue. They spent the next hour discussing possibilities. Jake's back throbbed with every movement, but his mind was clearer than it had been in days. For the first time since arriving on Kepler 442b, he felt like he was doing something important. More than that, he wasn't doing it alone. The Veltar brothers listened to his suggestions with respect, and their own ideas were clever and well considered. They were planning together, human and Zephyrian working as equals. When the brothers finally left, promising to return tomorrow with more information, Lyra remained behind. She sat quietly beside Jake's bed, occasionally checking his bandages or helping him drink water. "Your brothers are good people," Jake said eventually. Lyra smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her in days. "They're stubborn and proud and sometimes foolish. But yes, they're good people. They just needed to remember that goodness isn't limited to our species." Jake closed his eyes, feeling exhaustion creep back in. The pain medication was making him drowsy, but before sleep claimed him again, he had one more question. "What happens now?" Lyra was quiet for so long that Jake thought she hadn't heard him. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with something that sounded almost like hope. "Now we find the truth," she said. "And maybe we find something else too." "What's that?" "A way to fight back." Jake drifted off to sleep with those words echoing in his mind. And for the first time in 2 years, his dreams were not of Earth or freedom, but of the future they might build together on this harsh red world. Jake woke to the sound of whispering voices. The medical bay was darker than usual, lit only by the glow of monitoring equipment. As his eyes adjusted, he could make out several figures gathered around his bed. The Veltar brothers, Lyra, and 2 humans he recognized from the maintenance crew. "What's going on?" Jake asked quietly, trying to sit up despite the protests from his healing back. Kale stepped forward, his expression grim but determined. "We found the evidence. Vex has been stealing from the colony for 8 months. One of the humans, a woman named Carol who worked in communications, moved closer to Jake's bed. She looked nervous but excited. "We tracked the power consumption patterns you suggested. Every theft corresponds to unusual computer activity in the data processing center during Vex's duty shifts." Dren produced a small data pad from his jacket. "We also found his private accounts. He's been selling the stolen materials to black market traders who dock at the mining station on Proxima C." Jake felt a mixture of satisfaction and worry. They had found their proof, but proving a hegemony officer's guilt was dangerous territory. "What do we do with this information?" "That's what we need to decide," Voss said, his young face serious. "We could report it to Commander Thex, but Vex might have supporters among the other officers." Lyra shook her head. "Thex doesn't care about justice. He only cares about maintaining order. If we accuse Vex without overwhelming proof, he'll probably just execute all of us to make the problem disappear." The second human, an older man named Frank who supervised the mining equipment, leaned forward. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Word about what Jake did has been spreading. Both humans and Zephyrians are talking about it." "What kind of talk?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew. Frank glanced at the others before continuing. "People are asking questions. If a human can show that kind of honor, maybe we've been wrong about each other. If someone can stand up to hegemony punishment and survive, maybe we're not as powerless as we thought." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the medical bay's temperature. He had taken those lashes to save Lyra, not to start a rebellion, but he was beginning to realize that sometimes individual actions had consequences far beyond their original intent. "There's more," Carol added. "Some of the communications staff have been monitoring off-world transmissions. There's been fighting on 3 other worlds, coordinated uprisings by humans and local species working together." Kyle's eyes sharpened. "How coordinated?"
"Very," Carol replied.
"They're sharing tactics and intelligence. Someone is organizing resistance across multiple systems." Jake looked around at the faces surrounding his bed. A week ago, these people had barely trusted each other. Now they were talking about rebellion like it was a real possibility. The change was both inspiring and terrifying. "Even if there are other uprisings," Jake said carefully, "this colony is still heavily defended. The guards outnumber us and they have better weapons." Voss smiled grimly. "Not as heavily defended as you might think. My brothers and I have been watching the guard patterns for months. Most of their security relies on keeping us divided and hopeless. Dren nodded agreement. They have 40 guards for over 300 workers. If we acted together, the numbers would be in our favor. But only if we act together, Lyra emphasized. Humans and Zephyrians as one group, not two separate ones. Jake understood what she was really saying. His sacrifice had created a bridge between the species, but that bridge was still fragile. One mistake, one moment of old prejudices taking over, and it could all collapse. There's something else we need to consider, Frank said quietly. Even if we succeed here, the hegemony will send reinforcements eventually. We'd need to be ready for a longer fight. Carol pulled out another data pad. That's where the communications equipment becomes important. If we can coordinate with other uprising worlds, we might be able to time our actions for maximum effect. Jake listened to the discussion that followed, amazed by the complexity of what they were planning. Weapon seizures, communications blackouts, coordinated strikes on key facilities. It was far more sophisticated than anything he had imagined possible. But as he listened, Jake also realized something else. They were asking for his approval. Not officially, but every suggestion was directed toward him, every plan explained as if he were the one who would make the final decision. "Why are you telling me all this?" Jake asked when there was a pause in the conversation. The group exchanged glances. Finally, Cale spoke for all of them. "Because you showed us what courage looks like," he said simply. "Not the courage to fight when you're angry, but the courage to act when it's right. That's the kind of leadership we need." Jake felt overwhelmed. He had never wanted to lead anything, let alone a rebellion against the most powerful military force in the galaxy. But looking at these faces, human and Zephyrian, young and old, all united by a common hope, he realized that leadership wasn't always about wanting power. Sometimes it was about accepting responsibility when others needed you to. "If we do this," Jake said slowly, "people will die. Good people, people with families and dreams. Are we sure it's worth the risk?" Lyra leaned forward and took his hand gently. "People are already dying," she said. "Every day in small ways and large ones. The only question is whether we die as slaves or as free people fighting for something better." Jake looked into her eyes and saw his father's words, reflected there, the belief that sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting that you would suffer for it. But he also saw something his father might not have understood, that suffering shared with others was different from suffering alone. "All right," Jake said finally. "Tell me what you need me to do." The next 3 days passed in careful preparation. Jake remained in the medical bay, officially recovering but actually coordinating with small groups of conspirators who visited under the pretense of checking on his health. The network of resistance grew quietly, spreading through both human and Zephyrian communities. The breakthrough came when Carol managed to intercept a message from Lieutenant Vex to his black market contacts. Not only did it confirm their evidence of his theft, but it also revealed that he was planning to frame another worker, a young Zephyrian named Thane, for the next missing shipment. That night, as Jake finally felt strong enough to leave the medical bay, Lyra brought him something unexpected, a formal challenge scroll written in traditional Zephyrian script. "What is this?" Jake asked, though he could guess from her expression. "It's a Velthera declaration," Lyra explained. "In our culture, when someone has sacrificed for another, their family is bound to offer them a place of honor. My brothers want to formally adopt you into our family line." Jake stared at the scroll, its elegant alien writing beautiful even though he couldn't read it. "What would that mean?" "It means you would have the right to speak for our family in all matters," Lyra said. Including matters of honor and justice, Jake understood. If he accepted this adoption, he would have the cultural authority to challenge Lieutenant Vex publicly. Under Zephyrian law, family members could demand justice for crimes against their own. The next morning, Jake walked into the central courtyard for the first time since his punishment. His back was still bandaged and walking was painful, but he moved with purpose. Behind him came the Veltar brothers, and behind them, a growing crowd of both humans and Zephyrians. Commander Thex was inspecting the morning work assignments when he noticed the gathering crowd. His 4 eyes fixed on Jake with obvious displeasure. "The human should be working," Thex announced. "Recovery time is over." Jake stopped in the center of the courtyard and held up the Velthera scroll. "I claim family right of justice under Zephyrian law," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the space. I accuse Lieutenant Vex of theft and false accusation. The courtyard erupted in whispers and gasps. Vex looked confused and angry. What nonsense is this? Kale stepped forward and spoke in formal Zephyrian, then translated for the crowd. Jake Morrison has been accepted into our family through Velthera bond. By our law, he has the right to seek justice for crimes against family members. Lieutenant Vex pushed through the crowd of guards, his face red with anger. This is ridiculous. You can't apply alien laws to hegemony operations. Jake smiled grimly. Actually, under Colonial Administration Code 774, local cultural laws are recognized for family disputes. You should know that. You're the one who's been altering the legal databases. Carol stepped forward with her datapad. We have proof, she announced. Power consumption records, financial transactions, communication intercepts. Lieutenant Vex has been stealing from this colony for months. The evidence was overwhelming. Even Commander Thex, corrupt as he was, couldn't ignore data that clear. But Jake knew that proof alone wouldn't be enough. They needed something more dramatic, something that would unite the workers permanently. As Vex began shouting denials and threats, Jake made his final gamble. I challenge you to trial by combat, he called out, his voice cutting through the chaos. Zephyrian law allows it, and you've just claimed that hegemony officers are above such laws. Prove it. It was a desperate move. Jake was still healing and had no military training, but he was counting on Vex's arrogance and the symbolic power of the challenge.